I'm going to talk today about dissociation and how we've used perceptual control theory to understand it and guide our clinical interventions. I'm going to first cover a key distinction in dissociation and then talk about how and when dissociative experiences are a problem or a clinical experience, clinical phenomenon. Then we'll cover the theory, then our therapy meta levels, and then also our CBT for bipolar disorder, because this links into some of the same concepts. So what are the key features of dissociation to explain? A while ago I was involved in a project to review the literature that attempted to distinguish between the different components of dissociation, and we concluded that there were two key clusters of experiences: detachment experiences such as depersonalization, derealization and emotional numbing, and compartmentalization, which involves the aspects of dissociative identities, functional amnesia and somatization. Now I'm going to come back to why I think those two different experiences are different and distinct when we cover the model. But now I'm going to really focus on particularly what makes dissociation problematic. Why is it a component of so many different disorders, and not just dissociative disorders, as you can see from these examples that we find in PTSD and anxiety disorders as well? Well, there's a strong argument that brief dissociative experiences are very common in the general population, and that there are ways that the mind, the brain, dissociates that's actually adaptive, i.e. ways that it splits and specialises. These have been termed various things in the literature, such as absorption, mental imagery, divided attention, and even in the social psychology literature, the idea that people have different social selves that they use flexibly in different social situations. And so this might suggest to us that it's possible for what is described as dissociation to be functional and adaptive. So therefore, what is it that makes it a problem? Our proposal is that dissociation is a problem only when it interferes with a person's important personal goals. So it threatens their self-identity, for example, maybe to be emotionally in touch when they're emotionally numbed, or it gets in their way of connecting with other people. For again, emotional numbness can have that effect, or it could basically, the effect of dissociation could be something they really worry about might affect them physically, and it may be the dissociative symptoms themselves that interfere with personal goals, or it may be the way that the person's trying to control and manage and maybe even suppress or remove these kind of dissociative experiences. Our proposal is that either of these could be what's driving the problem, and not dissociation in itself, which potentially could be normal and functional. And this is where we bring in perceptual control theory, because it's a theory of goals and how they're organised in a hierarchy and how they're part of a basic process of control. The theory was developed a long time ago through the 50s and 60s, and a key element of the theory is that it sort of continues where homeostasis leaves off. So we know from biology that homeostasis involves the maintenance of physiological variables essential for survival, like blood oxygen levels, body temperature, etc. And these systems work through what's called a negative feedback loop, where we reduce the discrepancy between the standard, so for example 37 degrees for body temperature, and what the current body temperature is. And the bigger the discrepancy, the more action, or in biology it's the hormones, for example, more they will be secreted and then regulate the physiological variable to reach its desired level. Now, these systems within biology are uncontroversial, and they're relatively grounded within very early development. Essentially what PCT says is that there's another set of control systems that develop just like the homeostatic ones, but these ones are in the brain and they control perceptual variables rather than physiological ones, and they use behaviour as the way of doing so. And it's the as these methods of controlling perception develop, they are developing specifically to meet the intrinsic needs, the basic needs. So the individual will learn ways of perceiving the environment, of setting goals in the environment that achieve deeper intrinsic needs, such as the ones that I've covered there. And so this, what we call perceptual hierarchy, develops in layers guided by the biological system. And some classic examples of where behaviour is controlling perception is where in attachment theory we're controlling our proximity to a caregiver, or maybe when someone's very focused on their emotions, their anxiety, they're trying to get their emotions or their arousal within a certain range. And the idea is that these perceptual experiences are very strong signs of more intrinsic needs, and that's why we learn to be attuned to them and develop ways of managing them. And as I was saying, the idea is that these perceptual goals develop in a hierarchy, and there was some fascinating work by Frans Ployd and Van der Rit, who worked initially with infant chimpanzees and then with children, and they plotted the stages of development and proposed that they mapped on to new ways that the child is perceiving the environment and therefore controlling the environment to meet the goals at that level. The very lowest level in the hierarchy is the basic intensity of sensory input, but then beyond that the control becomes increasingly more sophisticated as we go up levels. We form patterns of sensations, we form relationships between events, for example. This diagram, I hope, illustrates what I've been saying up till now. On the left we have the intrinsic goals that are controlling physiological variables, and these are feeding in with that large arrow in the middle the way that the perceptual hierarchy is learning. And this is a process called reorganization, which I won't go into too much detail, but it's responsible for helping the individual to grow up and learn these new layers, these new ways of perceiving the world. And so you can see from intensities through sensations, configurations upwards. These are the hypothetical layers in the control hierarchy in PCT, and that part of the individual interacts with the physical and social environment. So this hierarchy is very interesting because it allows within it methods of the hierarchy dissociating both vertically and horizontally, and that in turn allows different modes whereby it can operate. Powell specified 4 specific modes. These are automatic, controlled, passive observation and the imagination mode. And these modes are basically formed from functional splits in the hierarchy. And if we imagine this, different goals are essentially potentially split vertically in the hierarchy, but different levels going from concrete to abstract are split horizontally in the hierarchy. We'll return to this in a bit. But one key thing is the imagination mode, because this allows our own internal standards and goals, which we often represent as images of what we want to perceive. This mode allows us to feed back that goal into the layer where it's perceiving, so that we can imagine as if we were currently perceiving that experience. And so what we're going to suggest is that the vertical splits in the hierarchy are more parallel to compartmentalization. They're sort of latent, they're set within the system in these layers, whereas the horizontal splits are the ways that this hierarchy can function with layers at one level operating independently from layers at another level. Now this is the model, sort of the working model that we're using to illustrate this. In this example we have some horizontal splits, which were the dotted lines, and we have an example of a vertical split, 2 different social selves, if you like, 2 different aspects of the self that a client can describe. Now they may or may not be aware of how these two sides of the self function. But social psychology literature suggests that it's actually very adaptive to have different sides of the self, but to be aware of those and bring them into action when necessary. So that's represented by this top level box, which illustrates how a person might regulate and control those different sides of themselves that they express. And those different sides of themselves are going to impact on the kind of goals that the person puts into action at any one point. Now normally this whole system works from the top to the bottom and back upwards. It's interacting with the environment both through, on the left, the internal senses such as arousal level, proprioception, and also the external senses such as hearing, smell and touch, which obviously are then interacting with the environment. And in the controlled mode in PCT, this whole system is linked horizontally. But we get what's called the imagination mode, which are represented by this cycle, occurring when you have short circuits, if you like, in this system, horizontal splits. And this allows us to represent some of our goals and principles internally without necessarily connecting that with action at the lower levels. Now this diagram illustrates how we might use and maybe contrast and imagine two different sides of ourselves in our mind's eye, and not necessarily implement them in action, because we've got these this sort of separation going on between what's going on in our heads and what we're actually implementing, denoted by the two dotted lines at the bottom. And this is a functional way of dissociating according to our model. It's a way of splitting up our mindsets to manage goals and hopefully achieve a resolution to them. However, our argument is that you can get the same topography, but this can be a very conflicted and problematic process if a number of things are going on. Firstly, if there's very little overarching concept of these different social selves, so the person's only aware of one or the other, that's why we've got the dotted lines on the arrows at the top there. This will be experienced much more as conflict and separate sides of the self, which are distressing and compartmentalized. And then on the bottom layer, we have ways that a person might dissociate from their internal senses that are less controlled, like depersonalization and numbing, and ways that they might dissociate from their external senses that's uncontrolled, such as ruminating and self-focus, being stuck with thoughts in their own heads. And so this time we represent that imagination mode, because it's out of control, as intrusive imagery, impulses and potentially hallucinations. And so we get the same layout, but this system is now conflicted and not operating smoothly. It's dissociated like the other system, but the dissociation is much more stark because the person's got limited awareness of the different sides of themselves, and these are the consequences of the experiences that they're separating. So Method Levels is the therapy that we've used to work with all kinds of presenting problems. It dates back to the 50s and 60s, but it was enhanced by Tim Carey in 2006. We would suggest that it helps people to regain flexible control of their current experiences, including dissociative ones, and their lives. And it's a transdiagnostic approach. We don't hone in on one particular disorder. We have a goal to ask about the present problem as the person is aware of it, and we have a second goal, which is to ask about disruptions which potentially note either conflicts the person's experiencing or higher level goals in our hierarchy that you just saw. And that's essentially the way the therapy works. It's just a series of curious, empathic questions. There's no advice, interpretations, and no explicit formulation. And we would argue that it fosters a kind of metacognitive, mindful state to aid resolution of these conflicting goals. But it does so in a conversational format rather than some form of training. And there's initial findings in pragmatic settings, which are promising, and we're doing trials on it right now, which are also reaching a stage of writing up, which is encouraging. So just to give you an illustration of what method levels might look like, or can look like, for a dissociative experience. I'm just going to describe, I'm just going to count to you a vignette, and then we can review it afterwards. Okay, so the client says, I just numb myself to everything when I get too stressed out. It's my only way of coping. Can you tell me more about what numbing yourself involves? I switch off, cut off my feelings, cut off my emotional pain. It's scary at times. It worries me. Describing it like that, how does it sound to you? It sounds desperate, not how I want to be, but what else can I do? How do you want to be when you're stressed out? Calm, but in touch with my feelings. How does that sound? Client shows a look of shock. It sounds like I would just get walked over, manipulated by people. I just can't see it working. What happened there when you said that, referring to the look of shock? I just got a thought of what people would do to me if I was calm. It was nasty. So you've told me about numbing yourself as one option and being calm, but in touch with your feelings as another option. How are these looking to you right now? So the therapist is comparing those two options. They both look bad. Either I'm cut off and tough and lose a sense of who I am, and I just drink and keep it going, or I do keep in touch with my feelings, but I get abused by other people. I can't win. What is it about being in touch with feelings and getting abused? What's that link? What do you mean? Or does it follow the other, or do they happen at the same time, or what? I've never really thought of that. They seem the same thing to me. If I open up to my feelings, I open myself up to other people. And how does that sound to you? It sounds quite true, actually. What's going on when you went, I thought of when I open up here in therapy and show some of my feelings, just some of them. I guess you don't take advantage of them. How does that work? Well, I guess I feel in control of what I open up to, and I know that I can numb them out if I really want to, but I don't. Right, what is it about control that's important? Well, that's what I want, really, to feel in control, especially when I'm stressed out. I don't feel in control when I'm numbing myself out too much. In fact, things can get a lot worse in that state. I need some other way to be in control when I'm with people who might harm me, some way to be less vulnerable. And smiles. What's making you smile just then? Oh, I just saw myself when I was working as a caterer years ago, before things got so bad. I could be in control then, but I could also tell people how I felt. I got respect from people. How clear is this picture of yourself? Well, I can see this time when I try to deal with a really nasty customer. I'm really animated. The image is clear, and then I get angry and it just seems to fade out. I remember I did get my way with him, but I can't remember how. What are you thinking right now as you have this image? I'm thinking that there's another way of dealing with stress by maybe still being in touch how I feel. I don't want to be a really angry person though. That would make me as bad as them. How angry do you think is about right? That's an odd question. Is there a right amount of anger? I never really thought there was. Do you mind if I think about that? And this would be this just happens to be the end of the session, this example. But also you could go into exploring what that right amount of anger would really look like on a continuum. Okay, so when I give this talk live, we'll discuss this method level session and how it fits or is similar or not similar to other therapies, so have a think about that. But essentially, in this session, the therapist is merely asking questions that fit those two goals, asking about the present experiences and catching disruptions, and just helping the client to expand on them and describe them. In doing so, it appears in this script that the client is actually talking about two different sides of themselves and weighing them up in their mind's eye. And that's the way it may unfold for a kind of compartmentalized experience like this. Okay, just going to mention our team's intervention, Think Effectively About Mood Swings, which is a CBT for bipolar disorder. This is more of a traditional CBT format than method levels, but it fits with the same essence. Particularly, we help people identify their higher level goals and values, the ones that basically transcend the different sides of themselves there are. And we help them to really describe the different selves that they get into in their high and low moods and in between. And so we help them to really describe and become aware of what those self states actually feel and look like. They monitor them, how they change over time, and they tell us how much control they have over them. And our goal ultimately is to help people to have a sense of self which may be involved, may use some of these existing states or not, but it's one that they sense as being more healthy, or they may have their own word of describing that. And we have a case series published that it's got very promising findings, large effect sizes for depression and people with bipolar disorder, and also effects on mood swings. And we're doing an RCT on this at the moment. So essentially, this is a summary of our approach. We think it's important to state that dissociation itself can be adaptive, and so we have to identify why it's a problem. And we also need to come in and focus on a framework to model how dissociation actually works using a theory. And we use perceptual control theory. And method levels is the therapy that we're actually using for this. Teams is our therapy that we've adapted to bipolar disorder, and we're engaging in all kinds of research. I don't have time to talk about today to test these models and to test the effects of the therapies.